I'm delighted to welcome someone who epitomizes this leadership role in Professor Sir David King, who was appointed as the Foreign Secretary's Special Representative for Climate Change in September 2013 and brought a wealth of expertise to that role. Sir David had previously served as the government's Chief Scientific Advisor from 2000 to 2007, and during this time he raised awareness of the need for governments to act on climate change and was instrumental in creating the Energy Technologies Institute. Sir David is also chairman of the Future Cities Catapult, and his previous roles have included serving as the founding director of the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at Oxford, Chancellor of the great University of Liverpool, and senior scientific advisor to UBS. Sir David has published over 500 papers on science and policy, for which he has received numerous awards and holds 22 honorary degrees from universities around the world. Elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1991, a Foreign Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2002, and knighted in 2003. Sir David was also made an Officer of the French Légion d'honneur in 2009 for work which has contributed to responding to the climate and energy challenge. Sir David is, quite simply, one of the most accomplished speakers I've had the pleasure to introduce in my time at Renewable UK. So I'd like you all to join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to our keynote speaker this morning, Professor Sir David King. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm, of course, delighted to be amongst friends. This short talk I'm going to give, I really want to stress just two things. One is the reason why we need to be shifting away from fossil fuels, and the second is how we are achieving it. So in looking at the reason why, I am going to go into the challenges that climate change itself is setting for us. While I was Chief Scientific Advisor, Maria, thank you for that lovely introduction, we had in 2003 the hottest summer in Europe still on record. And what I did then was, as you can see in black, this is going from 1900 to 2100 across here, that hot summer considerably hotter than the previous hot summer, 1947. Now what I did was go to the Met Office Hadley Centre and ask them to run backwards in time their model for climate change and the weather, and I stress and the weather, run backwards to see whether the model gives a decent description with the summer temperatures in Central Europe, and it looks pretty good, and then run forward in time to see what lies ahead of us on a not business as usual scenario, but a medium to high emission scenario going forward in time. So the Met Office model that predicts the weather for tomorrow and the next day includes greenhouse gases. So it's the same model, and they simply reinitiated the model a few times at different starting points, and what you see are those different starting points, which makes it look like noise. The noise is, of course, the weather, and the trend is the climate change. So what we see is that hot summer 2003 becomes, by 2050, under this scenario, the average summer temperature in Central Europe. Now let me take you back to 2003, the biggest natural disaster in Central Europe on record in terms of the number of fatalities, number of people who died, estimated to be about 50,000. So not recorded as a natural disaster because it was spread out over 6 weeks rather than a tsunami happening in one day. That's the challenge of climate change. As we move to 2050, then we're still on that rising slope, and the question then is, what are the risks associated with climate change? And what we did in the Foreign Office now 18 months ago was instigate a new type of analysis of the impacts of climate change, a risk assessment. And so what we did was go to insurance and reinsurance companies like Willis Re and work with them. So we used their technologies, their process, and we used statisticians, and we worked with experts from the United States, China, and India, and in the UK. And we met in all 4 parts of the world, and as I say, we ran this for about a year. And the first thing we did was say, what is the most likely pathway we're on, given political appetite for action? Normal position that a reinsurance company would take. What is the future going to look like? And then, based on that analysis, and it doesn't look too good, it's a 3.5 to 4 degrees centigrade world in IPCC terms, we then asked each country, and by the way, we had working with us experts, political advisors, politicians, admirals, generals, and the scientific community. What are the biggest challenges your country is faced with, we asked. So China came up with a group of challenges, one of which was simply high temperatures causing hundreds of thousands of fatalities in a given year. So exposure to high temperatures, high humidity, human beings can't get rid of the heat, and so their temperature rises, and so fatal conditions arise. 3 successive days in those conditions, and we don't survive. We know from experience in Qatar that this has been happening. Right, so this is the global average temperature increase, and we see that as soon as we get to about 4 degrees centigrade, the probability of this happening begins to take off. Now, for any government, and when I was chief scientific advisor, I had to worry about something that had only a 1% chance of happening, but with a major impact on the country. And what we're looking at here is a major impact occurring in northern India in blue, southeast China in red, southeast United States in yellow. So we see that as the temperature rises to these sorts of levels, 4 to 5 degrees centigrade above the present level, that we're suddenly in a world where this becomes highly likely in a given year. And when I say highly likely, a 50% chance in a given year once we reach temperatures of that sort of order. Now, next risk which the Chinese government were worried about was the failure of their 3 major rice crops. And so we looked at what happens is as the temperature rises during the flowering period of the plant, if the temperature rises above around 35, 36 degrees centigrade, the plant does not produce the rice that is needed. And so looking at the 3 different varieties of rice grown in Jiangsu province, which is where most of the rice is grown, we looked at the probability of crop failure in a given year, complete crop failure. And you'll see that the probability is rising above that 1% level quite quickly as the temperature increases. We're already teasing into that area of 1%, and it's rising quite rapidly moving forward in time. So by the time we get to a local temperature increase of 3 degrees centigrade, this is quite likely to happen at a level that means that the Chinese government would have to act in advance to protect their people. Now, of course, what is also happening is rising sea levels. The biggest rice production paddy field area in the world is in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. Mekong Delta, as the sea level rises, that becomes salinated. And so what we will see is the failure of the great Vietnam rice paddy fields occurring about the same time as the likelihood of this happening goes up. So one of the analyses that we did was a systemic analysis. This is all driven by the same factor, rising temperatures, rising sea levels, how the systemic analysis leads to a breakdown in the global economy. Now, what's the probability of exceeding that 4 degrees centigrade? you'll see that on the business as usual scenario, the scenario that we're on at the moment, the probability of hitting the 4 degrees centigrade temperature rise becomes well above 1% just past the middle of this century. So this pathway is one which clearly leads to a breakdown in the global economy around 2060, 2070. There's the nature of the challenge. This is why we need to act. It's not a pathway that we find attractive, of course. These are the other RCP pathways of the IPCC, and you'll see that it's only the best possible pathway going forward in time that yields a low enough probability to the end of the century and beyond to give us any comfort. And that's obviously then the pathway that I'm suggesting we have to be on going forward in time. Let's look at the probability of exceeding 7 degrees centigrade. On the business as usual pathway, we see that before the end of this century, the probability of exceeding 7 degrees centigrade temperature rise begins to take off, and it becomes a better than 50% chance as we go into next century. Now, I hope it's clear to everyone here from what I've been showing as well, that a 7 degrees centigrade world is not a habitable world in the form that we know it today. Now, we look at rising sea levels, and we looked at New York, Shanghai, Calcutta. We could have looked at London. And what we see is that the first city to go underwater is Calcutta. We made these analyses before the recent floods in Calcutta. So what we see is that this probability really goes off that 1% level at about 0.4 of a meter rise, which is the rise that we are anticipating by the end of the century in the middle of the probability range. But as we go towards the end of this century, there is a real probability that we'll be in this range here, heading towards 1 meter sea level rise. Ice is melting far more quickly from Greenland than had been predicted. And so the probability is unbearably high, I would say, that in any given year, one of these cities would be flooded, and flooded seriously. Calcutta clearly becomes unlivable as a city if we go down that pathway. Response. So let's move away. The detailed report is available. It's on site. Let's just look at what we are doing at the moment. So the IEA current forecast of emissions per annum in billions of tons of carbon dioxide, 1990 through to 2035 is shown here. This is the forecast, of course, beyond this point. And we see that it's leveling off, even though the Asia-Pacific region is very hungry for energy, and energy demand is going up. That is the current impact of renewable energy, bringing down the impact as we move forward in time. But the required path is a much sharper path downwards than the path that we're currently on. So there's good news and there's bad news. And the bad news is the gap in striped blue between the pathway we're on now and the pathway we need to be on. So what is the British government's actions and commitments? What have they been since, I'll take you back to 1997 when the Labour government came in and introduced renewable obligation on the grid for the utilities. We've gone through a series of moves, and 2 energy white papers. I was heavily involved in both of those. The 2005 Gleneagles G8 meeting, 2008 Climate Change Act of Parliament, the seminal arrival point of government policy. We had been really shifting around, working out what we needed to do until we got to that point. Before then, we had the Department of Energy and Climate Change formed in 2007, pulling together under one Secretary of State all of the decisions around energy production and our commitments under the Climate Change Act of Parliament to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050 and to be on a pathway towards that process with 4 yearly carbon budgets going forward in time, set by the Climate Change Committee working to the Climate Change Office. But at the same time, an international climate fund was announced, 1989, £3.89 billion. And just over a week ago, the Prime Minister announced refinancing of that fund. That fund is already committed and spent at about 3.93 billion, and it's been refinanced at there's an 8 missing here, 5.8 billion pounds. So $9 billion in our own international climate fund for spending overseas, largely in developing countries. And this compares with the Green Climate Fund, the global GCF, standing at about $11 billion. So the British effort overall is really way above the effort from any other country, and it has not been undone over the past few years. So I've survived a Labour government, a coalition government, and now a Conservative government. UK aid budget is highly relevant to this. That £5.8 billion is coming out of our aid budget here. I've got it in dollars. So the aid budget is currently about $18 billion a year and rising with GDP growth at 0.7% of GDP, fixed to that figure. That is development support with climate resilience and also climate mitigation in the developing world. The Africa situation is such that the British government is now committing itself to rolling electricity out to 620 million people in Africa who currently have no access to electricity. That could not be done without renewables, without batteries and microgrids. That's the mechanism for rolling out to villages that are remote, and it's estimated that it's about 4 times cheaper than extending the grid to those villages. So we just need to understand this budget is, over the next 5 years, going to be heavily used around financing that particular part of the exercise. There's a very big new market being developed in Africa for those 600 million people without grid connection at the moment. The ambition, and I have to say ambition, is to get there within this Parliament, within 5 years. Now, what is the current situation of renewable energy? Well, last year, the IEA reports that last year more renewable energy was installed than fossil fuel energy around the whole world. That's a remarkable situation. That's exponential rise, and we're still on that sharp exponential growth upwards. For the UK, this is the estimate coming from within government, 11,500 companies employing 460,000 people, annual turnover 122 billion pounds. This industry that I'm addressing today is now a leading sector in the UK economy, twice the turnover of the auto manufacturing industry, which is still producing more cars today than at any point in our history, even though we don't own the companies that are producing them. And the annual gross value of that renewable sector is equal to the total of the food and drinks industry in the UK. So let's sell ourselves a little better. This is already a big part of the British economy, and it's going to continue to grow. If we now look globally at the renewable demand, we're talking about $2 trillion a year at the moment, and John Kerry, in his talks around the world about climate change, is saying it's going to be a $4 to $6 trillion a year industry by 2020. This rapid demand for energy from the Asia-Pacific region, which continues, and from Africa, which is now rapidly growing. So there's a big new industry out there globally, and it's a big sector for us to play into. That is the export sector. G7 heads of government met in Germany in June, and the communiqué, June the 8th, reports a commitment of those heads of government to decarbonize the global economy over the course of this century, and also this second commitment which I think is of more than passing interest to this group, which is to create a surge in research into renewable energy and other low-carbon technologies, including energy storage and smart grids. Here's an international effort to bring together countries and within countries researchers to have a mission-oriented program to deal with the energy storage and smart grids issue in particular, so that we can roll out 24-hour, 365 days a year renewable energy as a stable mechanism for supplying electricity and, let me stress, and heat for economies around the world. So the idea, of course, is that it should become cheaper to provide electricity by this mechanism, renewables, smart grids, and energy storage, than fossil fuel, because once we can do it cheaper without any carbon prices, we're going to win the battle internationally. And if we don't manage that, we're not going to win that battle. What you have been facing up to is, or up against, is a fossil fuel industry that is fully mature, and you are, have been a new industry, and it's the learning curve that you're on that has dramatically changed the scene, and that learning curve is still going downwards. Now, what can we expect from the COP21 in Paris? Well, I think the outcome that can be expected is an agreement. I think after 21 years, we're going to finally get an agreement. And that agreement is under the heading of intended nationally determined contributions, each of the 197 nations putting down their own intended contributions. We've got most of those contributions in, India coming in just before the deadline, and it means that we can now all analyze where we're going, which pathway we're on, if those intended nationally determined contributions are all that we would have. Now, I say that because an absolutely essential element of the agreement from the British point of view, a red line for us, is that it must be a reviewable agreement. When we add up all these nationally determined contributions, we're going to find that we're still on a 3.5 degrees centigrade world. But what we must include in that reviewability is that we will move ahead to see that these nationally determined contributions are tightened up as we move forward in time. The rollout of cheap renewable energy with smart grids, with storage, is key to that process. Can new technology make a difference? Well, I've already indicated that it can. This is the Swanson's law, equivalent to Moore's law, the price fall in photovoltaic installation. We've seen a similar, well, a significant price fall in onshore wind, and it's happening to offshore as well. And this is a logarithmic plot, and we just noticed the price is now around $0.4, $0.3 a watt for installation of photovoltaics. And what Europe has done through feed-in tariffs has played a big part in that, creating this market, creating the demand, and the demand being met through competitive process, and the price is still coming down. Let me just speed up a bit. So the Clean Energy Program proposals, which received the blessing of the G7, have also been discussed by the G20. China and India keen to join in, is to create a new build energy, renewable energy program so that it is cheaper, as I said. Member governments of the program would agree to coordinate RD&D on this mission-oriented program for 10 years, starting next year, and a roadmap committee would be formed, probably co-housed by the International Energy Agency in Paris, a roadmap committee formed to see that this is all coordinated properly by the group in Paris, if it's going to be there, but working with the 10 or so different countries that are likely to be joining the program. The program that we would like to see is focused around renewable storage and transmission, nuclear, CCS, energy efficiency all have a role to play, but are seen to be outside the direct impact of this particular program. I'm talking to an audience that fully understands this. We need a whole range of new energy storage capabilities rolling out. There isn't one solution that will meet all of these different requirements, different timescales, different magnitudes of energy storage as well. And I just show you now a few little tasters. This is Professor Heindel's response to the idea of storing energy in a flat region of the world. Up-pumped water, hydropower is fine for Norway, not so easy in flat areas of the world. So what he's suggesting is if you take a flat area sitting on granite, use mining techniques to carve a cylinder of granite and pump water underneath the cylinder. The energy is then stored by the weight of the granite. And this, what I'm showing you here, 150 meters diameter, 250 meters deep, would store about a gigawatt hour of energy. So you're storing about 1 billion watt hours of electricity. And presumably you would give a warning to the farmer when this is about to happen. Here in the UK, there's work going on down at Portsmouth into cold and hot energy storage as a means of storing energy. There are many, many different ideas. And I finally leave you transport. By the time we get to 2050 in the UK, to achieve that 80% reduction, we will have had to switch electricity transport onto the electricity grid. So ground transport onto the electricity grid by 2050. And that's up to the car manufacturing industry to meet the various demands being created around Europe today. What I then leave you with is what about air transport? This is a British company, Varialift, designing a new kind of airship. As you can see, standing on an airport, this is, the airship is a little higher than the control tower. It's about 12 stories high in terms of comparison with a building. It's a very large structure, 200 meters long, 70 meters wide, and that has advantages. It's made of aluminium. Inside are 12 airbags and a helium compressor and a cylinder to contain the helium. You want to lift 1,500 tons of weight, that's what this is designed for, release the helium into balloons, and up it goes. Now to travel, you've collected tomatoes in Spain, you want to bring them to the UK to travel, covered with photovoltaics, and it uses solar energy, traveling at 30,000 feet above sea level, and it can do up to 300 kilometers an hour. You now deliver from an onboard crane onto the roof of the depot of Sainsbury's, Tesco's, and all the others. There's no need to land at an airport, and in fact, this can stay airborne for a very long time just by lowering the passengers and the crew down to the ground. So that's the sort of picture that innovation and wealth creation are creating as we shift away from the old fossil fuel-based economy. There is a real new opportunity for wealth creation that is embodied in this transition. Thank you.
I was going to take questions, but I don't think there's time.
Okay.
So David, can everybody hear me? I'm using this mic, not that mic. The word tomorrow's world just came into my mind when I saw the prospect of what we might expect in the future. But the thing that has most forcibly struck me from your presentation is, and I'm very, very grateful to you for it, is your lifting of what has been, across our industry, a somewhat depressive and depressed mood over the last 150 days of our current government. You are making me think we have been a little bit too insular and a little bit too focused on the negatives, when in fact you have made us all feel that we have much to celebrate and much to congratulate ourselves on in terms of how far we've actually come. We do still have an awful lot to do and an awful lot of challenges to overcome. But I am sure I speak for every person in the room when I say you have motivated and inspired us to want to move on to do it, for which I am, and I'm sure everybody else is, very, very grateful. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, I had hoped that we would have time to move on into the floor and ask for a few questions, but I'm afraid we are already quite a bit over time, and Sir David has a succession of media interviews to complete before we resume the rest of the morning's programme. So I'm really sorry if you had a burning question and you weren't able to do it. Perhaps we can forward one or two to you after the event. So thank you very, very much for your participation by being good listeners. Sorry you haven't had a chance for questions. Thank you once again, Sir David. And I just refer you now to our printed programme for where to be for the next sessions today. But perhaps just once more, we could say a nice big thank you to Professor Sir David King. Thank you very much. Don't forget your chocolate.